Hi. We're just going to talk a little bit about being responsible for what we create, and also perhaps touch on fear as something that we also create. Fear is something which we may not understand is a beneficial teacher. It is teaching us something. What was your question, Emily? You were asking a question before we did this recording.
Yeah, I was asking how do we really get to understand that we are responsible for creating everything in our lives? So we know it at an intellectual level. We can say, "Oh yeah, I know I'm responsible for my life," but actually, we don't really get it a lot of the time. We still blame outside experiences for having the effect on us. We just don't get that we are totally the creator.
So every experience that we're having, that we're creating, is actually an experience that we need to have, rather than something that is just happening and that we're not in control of. Yeah. So do you feel that we are actually in control of what we're creating, or we're not taking that responsibility? It's a difficult subject, this one.
It is, but I think it's really quite important to really now understand it and start to try and master this and live it a little bit, because we're moving now into this era of moving away from the victim, living as the light divine, living as a soul, and so we're kind of birthing into this new age. And I think it's all about this focusing on the external and blaming the external,
right,
when we're creating it.
How so for people who may be viewing our little discussion here, maybe they have some fears, or maybe they have some hopes and aspirations. They're on a spiritual journey, they're on a spiritual path. How do you know, how do you measure that if you're making any spiritual growth whatsoever? How do you know that you're actually getting somewhere in terms of your spiritual development, your spiritual growth? Is it this realization, this understanding that we have to take responsibility for everything that is happening to us? Is that a milestone that we begin to say, right, I do understand now. I am creating my life. I am having these experiences, good or bad, and that these experiences contain pearls of wisdom or teachings or lessons, which I am now going to actually begin to look at seriously and take responsibility for. Is that?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's something about that you're growing spiritually when you're not attached to what you're creating. You acknowledge and see what you're creating, but you're observing it and realising, okay, I've created this. Actually, now I'm at a place where I want to create something different. So you don't need to talk about it. When you're in victim, you're kind of wanting to make yourself right. You're wanting people on your side. You're wanting people to understand.
Sympathy,
get
poor me.
Yes, all of that. But when you've really transmuted that, you become very, very aware that every single thing in your life you are creating. And so you observe it. You don't need to be telling everybody.
Right.
You own it and you take responsibility for it, and you think, okay, actually now I'm ready
to move out of drama.
Yeah.
And ready to begin to create more
joy, more peace.
More peace.
Now, that's easy to say, but if you sit with your best friend who's got cancer, or somebody's had something, fairly dramatic happen in their lives, perhaps their brother's passed away, or something's happened, you talk to them and say, well, this is what you need to experience, and you've created this.
I don't think that would go down very well, would it?
No, not really. But at the same time, that's the truth, and people don't like to hear it. They don't want to hear it.
Because they don't want to take responsibility for what they're creating.
Yeah, because they don't want to take responsibility for what they're creating.
So one of the important steps that we must make in terms of our spiritual growth then is to be accountable.
To be accountable, yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
What about, there are things that come up though, we are all afraid of various things. Fear of losing our job, fear of not having enough money, fear of relationships, being cheated in relationships or being unhappy in relationships. There are all kinds of things that are still there. And if we have to take responsibility for those fears, that means that we have to begin to address our own fears or our own things that are within us which we don't really want to look at. Is that something that we've got to begin to do then?
I think so, and I think people will, we'll do whatever we can to avoid that. We'll go down any route possible to avoid, looking at that stuff that is really painful. And when you really look at it, as we've talked about it before, that every single fear, it comes down to this fear of death, and actually, at some point, not existing. Because what is death? That's a fear that at some point I don't exist.
Right, and so this fear of not existing, this fear of dying, is really the only real fear. Everything else that we think is an actual fear is ultimately boils down to the fact that if we don't exist, then we wouldn't have any fears, and we're afraid of not existing.
That's really what it comes down to. From
Gosh, that's
my understanding.
So we have this fear of not existing.
Yeah.
And yet we do exist. So I remember in a channeling that I did, my guides were saying that we have to die to that aspect of ourselves which is alive to fear. So if we can find an aspect of ourselves which is alive to fear, and make peace with that, make harmony with that, then what remains is a peaceful state, still alive, still conscious, still aware, but the fear of death or the fear of not existing is meaningless, because the soul aspect of who we are, the eternal aspect of who we are, comes forwards, and we understand that we are these eternal spiritual beings, and ultimately there's nothing to worry about, nothing to be afraid of, apart from the dream of what we're creating, thinking that this reality, this life that we live, is something that as soon as we take responsibility for it, as soon as we become accountable for what we create, we can begin to move further and further towards this state of non-attachment and inner peace. That comes naturally from taking responsibility.
Yeah.
And yet, the message then is, it is vital that we begin to grasp how important it is to be responsible for everything that we're experiencing and everything that we're creating.
And I think that takes courage.
Enormous courage, I would say.
It takes real courage. And we're all, and you can't beat yourself up about it, because we're all at different stages of what we need to experience. So I think you get courage from going within, and this is, a big part of, the work that you do in helping people to understand that taking responsibility, putting yourself out there, getting off the fence takes enormous courage, and it's that courage that comes from within us, that seat of the soul, and we've talked about it, haven't we? Anybody that we see as truly great are the people that can stand in that energy of courage without the fear that at some point they're not going to exist. I think that's really
absolutely fascinating. Perhaps we'll follow up this discussion with a short meditation. But for now, thank you very much, Emily. Bye-bye for now.